So welcome everyone uh, to the Initiative for Agency and Development Public Talk series. Today we have Dr. Ken Chomitz and Rachna Chowdhuri from Global Innovation Fund. I am Tauhidur Rahman. I am a professor in Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at University of Arizona. I am also the director of IfAD. For external participants, IfAD is a field experimentation initiative at University of Arizona. We are a group of interdisciplinary scientists working on discovering new frontiers in development through research, education, and outreach programs for individuals, groups, states, and organizational agency. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers, let me start by saying that our heart goes out to the people around the world who are battling the consequences of pandemic, which has further underscored the importance of individual, group, and state agency, and a better understanding of how they can be built through various kinds of development interventions, which is at the heart of IfAD. Now I introduce you to Dr. Ken Chomitz, who is the Chief Analytics Officer at Global Innovation Fund. He is responsible for developing systems for monitoring, evaluation, and analysis and learning. He joined GIF after a very distinguished and influential career in evaluation and research at the World Bank. He has done pioneering work, which he will not say himself, but it is really pioneering work in economics of climate change, biodiversity, and deforestation. As a senior advisor and leader in World Bank's independent evaluation group, he led major evaluation of World Bank's efforts in energy policy, climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. He was a co-author of World Development Report, which is very familiar to IfAD audience, World Development Report 2016, which focused on digital dividends. He was a National Research Council Fellow and a Professor of Economics at Boston University. He holds BS in Mathematics from MIT and a PhD in Economics from UC Irvine. He is widely recognized around the world as one of the most rigorous thinkers at the intersection of economics of climate change, evidence, and policy making. So you can imagine why I am so thrilled to have him today. Rachna Chowdhuri, she is the Senior Director of Analytics at Global Innovation Fund. She has extensive experience, which is unbelievable given her age, extensive experience in research evaluation and evidence-based policy making across Asia and Africa. Before joining GIF, she worked at the World Bank in Zambia in Nigeria. She was also the country director for Innovations for Poverty Action in Zambia. She was a research manager at JPAL, South Asia. She started her career as economics for a social enterprise working with small farmers in Vietnam and Laos. She has a master's degree in economics from University of Sussex and BA in economics from University of Delhi. Now we'll hand the platform to Ken and Rachna. They will talk for approximately 50 minutes, and then we will have about 30 minutes for question and answer. For logistics, please turn your mute yourself so that now our star guests, so that they can share the stage. And if you have any questions, please raise hands in Zoom system. You can flag yourself, or you can type your questions in the chat room. So with that, Ken and Rachna, welcome to University of Arizona. We are extremely thrilled to have you. Now the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Tauhid, and thank you for the overly kind introduction. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here with you today at the Initiative for Agency for Development. Agency, as you'll learn, is really close to our hearts. Our discussion today is going to be wide-ranging. So let me start by giving you the storyline. We are impact investors, Rachna and I at the Global Innovation Fund. We want to improve the lives of millions of people as much as we can with the limited resources that we've got. So we have to make choices. We have to invest in this and not in that. More than many impact investors, we base our choices on data and evidence. But like any development agency or an impact investor, our choices ultimately also reflect our values. So we believe first that it's really important to forecast the outcomes of prospective investments and then to track to see whether those outcomes are realized. And second, we think it's really important to be explicit about the values that we place on those outcomes. Anytime an investor chooses this rather than that, she's implicitly expressing some values. We think it's good discipline to actually be explicit and transparent about our values. And that takes us to women's and girls' agency. We attach high value to agency, both as a means, but also as an end in itself. And we think it's important to factor that into our investment choices. Today, we'll show you how we're going about that. So let me share my screen now. There, Tauhidur, did that work? Is everybody seeing my screen? I'll assume so.
Yes.
Yeah, we can see it.
So here's the outline of the talk. First, we'll tell you something about GIF, the Global Innovation Fund. We'll describe two challenges that we have in managing an impact portfolio of risky long-run innovations. We'll dwell a bit on the issue that impact quantification must reflect the measurer's values. And if the technology stays with it, we'll have a little bit of audience participation in this. Then we'll show you GIF's solution to this problem of how we quantify impact and use it to guide our investment choices. We call our system Practical Impact. Then I'll hand it over to Rachna, and she'll take us through the way that we extend impact quantification to include women's and girls' agency. And she'll take you through an example of practical impact in action as we evaluated a program called Taran Kitoli that promotes gender equality in India. So about GIF. GIF is a nonprofit fund based in London, offices in Washington and Nairobi also, about 35 of us. We invest in innovations that have the potential to scale up to help millions of people who are now living on less than $5 a day. We call ourselves an impact-first venture capitalist, in the sense, not that we're out to make money for ourselves, but in the sense that we're willing to take smart risks with the goal of maximizing social returns rather than our financial returns. And I should say that we can invest in any kind of venture, nonprofits, for-profits, and using any kind of financial instrument. So we use evidence and impact and a staged system of investment to try to decide which innovations to support and scale. So we have three windows for our funding. And the amount of funding that we provide is conditional on the amount of evidence that you offer when you ask us for funding. So if you've got this a brilliant idea that you just want to test out for the first time to see if it has promise, we've got a small amount of money for pilot projects like that. Those projects may or may not work, but if they show promise, or if you come to us with that kind of evidence, then we can fund you at a larger level, at what we call a test and transition or demonstration level. Here, the goal is really on proving that you have real social impact and understanding what are the conditions necessary to scale it up further. Not everything passes that stage, but things that do pass that stage, we're ready to fund at what we call a scale level, up to $15 million. But even then, we'd be building in evidence to try to understand how this innovation could be taken to even larger scale. So evidence is really at the core of what we do. Not only do we use evidence as a screen for deciding what to fund, but we encourage our investees to use rapid adaptive learning to generate operational evidence while they're under implementation. And we build a lot of evidence generation into our work. so that we can decide whether or how, or others can decide whether or how to scale the innovation, or whether to go back to the drawing board and refine it. Now, a key thing about GIF is that we work across all sectors and all geographies. So here's just a snapshot of a few of the 51 innovations we've supported. It includes agriculture in northern Nigeria. It includes mobile money and payment systems. On the upper right, we have a innovative water system in northern Africa, in Niger, educational technology in India, and in the center, our Taran Kitoli program that Rachna will describe in more detail later. So when we sat down to design how GIF would work, we realized that we needed a very special kind of impact metric. We needed a metric that would help us decide which project, which investment should we make, which one offers the highest impact of the candidates that we see. We wanted to be able to talk about the impact of our entire portfolio in a way that would let us track how much impact we expect to make. And finally, we wanted to do this in a way that balances rigor with practicality. We're not massively funded, and our investments are not all that large. So we need to be able to do this well enough, but with modest time and resource requirements. So we faced two challenges. The first challenge is comparing the seemingly incomparable. So there are many worthy funders who specialize on one specific area. They might focus on off-grid solar power or on reducing neonatal mortality. For a funder like that, they have a very well-defined metric. And so it's relatively easy for them to understand to compare different potential candidate investments. But we're working across all the sectors. And so we want to be able to choose the most impactful. And we want to be able to aggregate, talk about the total impact we're having. Now, some funders who work across sectors use people reached as a metric, but we find that inadequate. It's a starting point, but what does it mean to be reached? You may be reached by a radio message, or you may be reached by saving your life. So we want something a little more nuanced than that. Our second challenge is that we're focused on long-term portfolio impact. The things that we're investing in now are early stage startups. They're not generating so much impact right now because they're in this testing phase, but we hope that we can catalyze them to grow to have massive impact. And we know from historical experience that for a really impactful innovation, it can take 10, 20 years or more to reach the full addressable market, to reach all the people that it's capable of reaching. So what we want to do is credibly predict the impact long before it's actually known. And we also want to motivate attention to the total portfolio impact, knowing that some of our investments are going to fail, but others could have extraordinary impact. So this is analogous to what a venture capitalist does. And it's in contrast to what many development finance institutions do, where they rack up kind of a win-loss score. How many investments were rated moderately satisfactory or better versus the ones that are moderately unsatisfactory or worse. But in our view, that could encourage over risk aversion. The way we look at it, like a venture capitalist, if we make 10 investments, knowing that innovations, early stage innovations are certainly risky, maybe 5 of them won't pan out at all. Maybe 3 of them will be fairly good, not great, but providing benefits. Another one will be providing a lot of benefit, and maybe one will be a star that really scales up and reaches 10 million people. So we want to be able to talk about the impact of the entire portfolio rather than dwelling on win and loss. Now, here we come to one of the key points that we'd like to make in this talk, which is that when you're coming up with an index of impact, you're inevitably building in your values. And we want to illustrate how challenging that is and why it's worthwhile thinking about what your values are and trying to make them explicit. Now, remember that whenever you choose to do A versus B, you're making a value judgment. Often such choices are made with implicit value judgments, and maybe inconsistently. So we're going to do a little experiment if the technology smiles on us. So if you'll indulge me, we're going to do some polling. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want to stress that there are no right answers to these questions. It's just to elicit your values. The responses are going to be totally anonymous. If you'd like to join, please set your browser to this address on the screen, polev.com/gifund. If you do it on a phone, it might ask you to download the app. Forget that, just stay in the browser. If it asks you about cookies, and unless you're fond of cookies, dismiss them. You don't need to fill in the username, just click skip. And of course, warning, data charges may apply if you're not on Wi-Fi. So I'll give you a moment to figure that out. And let me hold on. So this is the warm-up question, just to get used to the technology. Here are 3 actual innovations. I know they're actual innovations because I found them on the internet. So I'd like you to choose which one you think is the most socially impactful. On the top, we have the drone-mounted umbrella. Number 2 is the combination radio and toaster. And at the bottom are the vacuum cleaner equipped shoes. So kindly just click on the one that you think is the most impactful, and we'll see what the audience thinks. Results are pouring in. We've got 32. Okay, I think I'm gonna call it now. Let's see what the answer is. Well, it's a close one, but it looks like the drone-mounted umbrella is the winner. So I hope that any innovators and entrepreneurs in the audience are thinking about that. All right, now let's go on to a somewhat more challenging question. So put yourself in the place of a development agency or GIF, and say that you're presented with these two potential innovations. Both are aimed at the same target audience. Both let's say that the target people are people who are living on $1,000 a year. Innovation A has greater depth and less breadth. That is, it's going to benefit 1 million people and make them each $100 a year better off. Innovation B has more breadth but less depth. It's going to benefit 10 million people, but they will only get $20 per person in annual benefits. This is not actually an unrealistic, it's very stylized, but it's not unrealistic. We do face questions of there are some things that benefit a few people a lot and many people less. So think about it a bit and please show me your answers. I'm not getting any results. Are people having trouble? Maybe it's, let me check that it's activated. Yeah, it's activated.
I put insert answer too. It should be.
Well, let me see if it's not showing up as on the counter. Let's see whether it's actually tallying. All right, it worked. So let's meditate on this for a moment. This is a really interesting result. And again, there are no wrong answers here. This reflects values, and any value is defensible. But it shows that people have placed different values on this issue of breadth versus depth. So the first, innovation A, generates a total of $100 million in benefits. Innovation B generates a total of $200 million in benefits, but spreads it more thinly. This group prefers innovation A. I suspect that a card-carrying old-fashioned economist might prefer innovation B. But again, there's no right answer. And if we had more time, I've enjoyed having conversations about why people value one thing versus another. But that's the goal of this exercise, to try to surface these values and preferences. So let's move on to an even more challenging one, and some people might find this particularly challenging. But again, it's a real life question. We get proposals to work in health, and we have proposals to work in education. We have to choose between them. So again, suppose we've got the same target population. Sorry, let me not show the responses for the moment. Same target population. Innovation A will save 1,000, let's say 1,000 infant lives. Innovation B will ensure that 1,000 children get an extra year of good quality education. Okay, going to reveal. Okay, overwhelmingly in favor of saving lives. And again, there are I've had interesting discussions where people have come up with quite interesting explanations of why they favor 1,000 the education. But now let's change it up a bit, and this will be the last one of this series. Same setup, but now I'm going to ask you to choose between 1,000 lives saved and 100,000 children receiving an extra year of education. Again, let me not show the responses for now. Okay. Let's see what we've got. All right, the sentiment has shifted. About 16% who favored lives saved have shifted over to education. So implicitly, for many people, though not for all, there is some trade-off between these two things. And again, we could have a really interesting discussion about value of a statistical life. There's a lot to talk about here, but when I do this with philosophy classes, they tend to stick with they tend to flip between these two choices. The philosophy classes stick with the lives saved. The economists and the public policy folks tend to flip between the first scenario and the second scenario. But this is all by the way of illustrating that we may have deeply held values, and it's worth, in our view, to try to surface those values and make them explicit, and especially at an institutional level, decide how you're going to govern your approach to investment. So let me show you our approach. We call it practical impact. So we start with the number of people, the number of low-income people who will benefit 10 years from now if this innovation scales in the way that we hope. Then we adjust that by a depth of impact. That is basically the proportional change in their standard of living due to the innovation. And finally, we adjust or discount that by the probability of success, the likelihood that that innovation we think will be successful in 10 years. So in doing this is clearly a difficult thing to do, but we're not aiming for 3 decimal place accuracy or even 1 decimal place accuracy. We're aiming for order of magnitude estimation. And we find that it's actually not that hard in many cases. So we get maybe 200 applications every month, and we read every one of them. We have an open window. Anyone in the world can submit a proposal for funding to us. So we can pick up an application, look at it and say, well, if this works, how many people are going to benefit? 100,000 people, million people, 10 million people. How big is that benefit per person? Just perceptible, significant, transformative, or life-saving? And what's the chance of success? Is it a long shot, or is it fairly likely? So again, this is just illustrating that the depth of impact can range from saving a few minutes a day for many people. So that's an example of a large breadth and a small depth. Or it could benefit a much smaller number of people, but save their lives. So that's built into our calculus. So we call our unit of impact measurement the kind of unwieldy name of person year of income equivalent. You can think of it as an impact adjusted life year. And the way it works, the way we think about breadth versus depth is we just take them as being multiplicative. So 1 PY means one person gets an additional 100% of income for 1 year, or 10 people get an additional 10% of income for 1 year, or 100 people get an additional 1%. And further, we can expand that using the techniques that those of you who've studied labor economics or health economics or environmental economics are familiar with. We can create equivalences for education, health, and mortality. So we can say that, for instance, a year of good quality education counts for us as 1 PYI. A reduction of 1 disability adjusted life year is 5 PYI. And a life saved is, we reckon, as 50 PYI. So using this system, we can communicate the expected impact of our total portfolio. We can say something like, our innovations are expected to impact 130 million people by an average amount of increasing their standard of living by 4%. Or alternatively, we can say that we expect to generate between 3.5 and 7 million PYI per year by 2030. So at this point, I think that before handing it over to Rachna, Rachna is now going to take this, which many of you may already think is pretty audacious in terms of boiling impact down to a single number. Rachna is going to take it to another level and explain how we fold women's and girls' agency into this framework. But before we do that, maybe I could take just 1 or 2 questions, Tauhidur, if that's okay with you. Just if there are any fundamental questions on the framework I've just laid out.
Sure. So anyone has questions? You can raise hand and unmute yourself and ask the question. So if not, actually, yeah. So, okay. Jen, go ahead.
Hi, this has been really interesting. Could you go back one slide for a second? I have a question about how you decided, what process you used to decide on the equivalence between, say, a year of education and income over a lifetime, and that sort of thing. Yeah, the equivalences. How did you come up with that, out of curiosity?
Sure, that's basically comes from the Manserian equation, where kind of a standardized fact from many hundreds of studies of wages in education says that a year of education gets you an extra 10% increase in your lifetime income, and we use a 10% discount rate. So with a little bit of calculus, that's how it works out.
So Ken, I had one question. So
yeah,
one was quickly. So it is clear that you put more importance to people who are poor, right? So in your evaluation of the depth of impact, do you also consider other criteria? For example, let's say giving higher weightage to women, children, and other marginalized groups when you look at the overall impact.
Well, I'm really glad you brought up the pro-poverty nature of this index. We can compare it to standard cost-benefit analysis. Uses a procedure that you might many of you might be familiar with, called value of statistical life. It looks at basically how much extra wages people would require to take on a slightly riskier job, or how much they say they would accept to incur a slightly higher risk of death. A feature of that approach is that it values lives in rich communities or rich countries more than it values lives in poor countries. So that a life in the U.S. in this system is worth, maybe is not worth, but is reckoned in public policy terms as $8 million, whereas saving a life in Burkina Faso is reckoned in VSL terms as $100,000. In our calculus, all lives are reckoned given the same impact. Saving a life is given the same impact, regardless of where it is. And furthermore, we rate it more important to take somebody from living at $2 a day to $2.20 than getting some. In other words, it's better to take somebody from $2 a day to $3 a day, because that's a 50% increase, than to take somebody from $5 a day to $6 a day, because that's only a 20% increase. So that's the major distributional adjustment we make. Plus, we are only reckoning benefits to people who are living on under less than $5 a day. We don't make any special adjustment for marginalized groups, but as you'll see, we're leading up to the grand finale, in which we explain how much emphasis we're placing on increasing on benefits to women's agency and benefits to women's safety.
Okay, so we have more hand raised. Please go ahead.
Hi, my question is about sustainable development. Like, does it translate an year of incremental education? Does that translate into 10%, person year equivalent of income? But do you factor in climate change and the nature of the livelihoods?
To the first approximation, we don't factor in the nature of the livelihood. Again, to be practical, we're working in many investments, and to be humble, we can't see that far in the future. We invest, for instance, heavily in early childhood education, because we believe that both the climate and the economy of the world in which children are growing is going to be changing radically, and to increase children's cognitive and emotional ability and adaptability is going to benefit them in a future that we can't really imagine yet. In terms of sustainability, we would certainly account social benefits for reductions in greenhouse gas. We haven't invested that much in things that do that, but we are investing in innovations that we believe will greatly increase the resilience of people and populations to climate change.
Thank you.
So now, Tauhidur, I think perhaps we should move on to the second part of the presentation, then recap with further questions later.
Yeah.
So let me then stop sharing and hand it over to
Rachna.
Rachna.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Let me see. Okay, I think this should work now. Yeah, great. Thank you, Ken, and thank you for all those good questions. I think a lot of this motivation helps kind of situate some of the work that we're doing to also enhance our practical impact methodology. And so, as Ken said, that at the core of GIF lies a difficult challenge of choosing investments across different sectors and locations that will generate the largest possible social benefit. So for selecting innovations and to assess and track impact for transformative gender innovations, GIF needed to really think about and have a toolkit that allowed us to go beyond some of these conventional measures. This is also because GIF is particularly interested in investing in innovations that challenge social norms and structural barriers to women's gain in agency and other gender equality outcomes. So as Ken mentioned, PI uses a single yardstick that can forecast the impact of innovations across different outcomes, including health, education, income, etc. So this forces us to really articulate our values and assess how and why we expect an innovation to be beneficial, and to also confront some of these real trade-offs, as some of you got some taste of that during the polling as well. However, as all of you know, the impact of gender innovations is highly complex to distill into any single yardstick comparisons. Gender impacts range from changes in social norms to decision-making to reduction in violence against women and girls. And we measure impact in terms of income, health all the time, but we're now trying to do this sort of ambitious and audacious thing of quantifying gender equality outcomes and then distilling it into a single yardstick measure. We know this is ambitious, but we felt that it's important enough that we attempted to try it out. Personally, I think for us, this work has been quite insightful. As we started to work on this and embarked on this work, we didn't really know how we could do justice to such a complex problem. The answer was to kind of just try it out and start working on this. So what I'm going to show you today is a lot of the progress that we've made. But this is definitely a first step, and there's a lot more to be done. And I think we can only improve by being challenged and critiqued, and that's something that I am excited to do with different stakeholders who are thinking about similar questions. Within the world of research and measurement, we often see a number of sort of siloed camps as well. I think particularly the more utilitarian view that us economists tend to have is sometimes seen as opposition to a more rights-based framework. We've always believed that I think there's a way that we can marry these two worlds, and our work is really a testament to this. And I'm really proud of this work also because it demonstrates that we can really push our assumptions and frameworks to build more space in the room and to expand our thinking. That is something that I think the field of gender equality investments needs more of. So let me step back and give you a little bit of a motivation as to why we want to measure gender equality outcomes. First, we want to measure it because we want to prioritize investing in gender equality amongst the list of a lot of different innovations out there. Quantification and measurement allows us to elevate and prioritize gender equality amongst other things, and measurement is a way that GIF can then show that we value outcomes such as increasing agency for women and girls. agency is really at the heart of a lot of our focus on our gender subfund, which is looking at investing in innovations that have transformative impacts for women. GIF, I mean, we understand that this is very difficult to do, but we also understand it's important because by not measuring agency at all, we are somewhat implying that we value it as zero, which is not correct. So by analogy, I think if we cast our minds sort of 30, 40 years ago, Human Development Index, for example, demonstrates that in development, we have gone beyond income and wealth as metrics for what is important to development in a country. Second, quantification is also important because it allows us to prioritize within gender equality innovations. So within gender equality innovations, quantification of gender impacts is important for comparison. At GIF, we want to be able to compare impacts across innovations to weigh impact and as well as cost effectiveness. Here again, we have an analogy. So this is something that public health experts have sort of struggled with previously in terms of creating some scale that allows you to compare across different illnesses. But they have done this in a systematic way using the disability adjusted life year or DALIs, which is a measurement that compares and weighs different severity across one scale. So on your screen now, you see this, that how indexing and using a single scale for comparison can help with priority setting. So this graph, for instance, takes data from the global health, global disease burden and shows that the top 10 risk factors for health outcomes in low income countries. And this comparison allows public health experts to discuss innovations that have most impact, but also set priorities for funding as well as research in public health. This was the motivation behind taking up the challenge of trying to quantify and then value agency. This led to months of sort of extensive work as well as consultation, and we presented some of our thinking and learning widely to academics as well as practitioners. And these consultations allowed us to really sort of fine-tune some of our thinking as we came up with a framework about how best to include gender impacts into practical impact. So as a culmination of this work, we came up with this framework that you can see on the screen. On the left-hand side, we have 3 areas of intervention that GIF is supporting to promote gender equality outcomes. So we look at innovations that promote agency in voice, body, and assets. This requires a deep understanding of multiple and varied dimensions of gender equality and how they are rooted in a lack of agency for women and girls and gender non-binary people. Promoting gender equality means having tangible control over one's assets, body, and voice at different levels. So household, community, democratic political system, as well as the economic system. This is what we seek to achieve using the power of innovation as a catalyst. So innovations may work through one or more of these spheres on the left-hand side, and they don't always neatly work through one of these areas, but might overlap. On the right-hand side are the different measures that capture the impact of these innovations. So the third measure that you see, the well-being outcomes, are the measures that our traditional practical impact model already includes. But to incorporate gender equality outcomes, we added 2 more measures, which is agency and safety, or the reduction in violence against women and girls. The agency measure is not just sort of participation in decision making, but also the ability to choose. And I will go a little bit more in detail to talk about the agency domains. But the reduction in violence against women and girls captures how innovations impact women's experiences and exposure to violence. This includes measures of both intimate partner violence as well as non-partner violence and violence risk and incidents. One sort of important distinction here is that there's not a sort of one-on-one relationship between the areas of intervention on the left and measures on the right. We may have an innovation that works through one of these areas on the left-hand side, but the impacts can be captured across many different measures. So let me explain that using an example of an innovation that GIF supports. It's an innovation called No Means No Worldwide. It provides a rape prevention training curriculum called Empower, aimed at boys and girls between the ages of 10 to 20. And they teach young adolescent boys and girls mental, verbal, and physical self-defense and other skills to be able to identify and intervene and navigate risky situations, particularly who are at risk of sexual assault and sexual violence. The program has reached around 40,000 adolescents across different countries in East Africa. Looking at this innovation now through the lens of this framework, we see that the innovation primarily works through the area of voice by amplifying boys and girls' voice when confronted in sort of within unsafe, risky situations. But when it comes to impacts, the impacts are captured by two measures, so both agency and violence against women. So it captures the reduction in violence against women through girls navigating risky situations, but also by boys stepping in and intervening, and hence causing a reduction in the incidence of rape. But also agency by increasing confidence and bringing voice to a lot of the girls who can stand up for themselves. So this is a demonstration of how we can view different innovations that as opportunities through this framework as we kind of started to think about including these measures into practical impact. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, let me zoom in a little bit more into the measure of agency. So for our impact forecasting model practical impact, we had two key questions coming up with agency measures. The first was, how do we even measure agency? And the second was, of course, how do we value agency for our single yardstick comparison? To be able to sort of first answer the question about how we measure agency, we also had to define agency for ourselves. And the way we define agency is women and girls having choice, exercising choice, and the achievement of the outcome of choice as well. We then categorize agency across three domains. The first is control over body, that includes contraceptive choice, sexual partner as well as sex choice, fertility decision-making, and menstrual management. The second domain of household decision-making includes financial and non-financial decision-making, as well as freedom of mobility and choice of marriage. Finally, the social and community domain is both participation and decision-making in social and political spheres. Now, the second question around how we value agency is an important one. This is because for us to, again, distill agency impacts into a single yardstick, we need to be explicit about our values. Here, we make it explicit that we value both the means of achieving agency as well as the outcomes achieved because of greater agency. So for instance, we value well-being measures like income, education, that perhaps might be results of agency gain because of an innovation, but also we value the gains in women's ability to exercise or expand their choice or assert themselves as means to achieve these outcomes as well. So this is kind of the thinking behind as we sort of started thinking about defining measures as well as how best to then put our values for agency as well. So now let me go through a little case study to explain how we create an agency index and forecast impact of our innovations. So the example that I take is an innovation that GIF recently funded in India. This NGO called Breakthrough. So Breakthrough is a nonprofit that addresses gender inequality and violence against women through its innovative Taro Ki Toli curriculum, which is delivered to young adolescent girls and boys in government schools, which is designed to really change aggressive gender attitudes, particularly at an age where children are engaging with their own identity formation and their attitudes are malleable. So looking at age groups between, again, 10 to 13, sort of pre-adolescent and adolescent age group. The program challenges gender norms and stereotypes through this curriculum. GIF was really impressed with Breakthrough's work in one of the states called Haryana, which is actually the state with one of the worst gender outcomes in India, where they also conducted a rigorous impact evaluation that showed that girls and boys did update their gender attitudes because of the program. This demonstrated that the program had potential for significant and lifelong impacts on gender attitudes. So this program has garnered a lot of excitement by other state governments as well, particularly because this is a program that's actually implemented in public schools settings. So this is something that ministries of education can perhaps even take on as a curriculum and make it part of their schooling, school curriculum. So 2 states in particular, Punjab and Odisha, have reached out for a collaboration, and GIF is funding Breakthrough to replicate this model and scale it up in these 2 states. So in terms of the theory of change for this program, in the short run, the innovation aims to change gender attitudes of girls and boys. For example, girls own her own belief on perception on household work share, how much she should study, if she should have the freedom of mobility, etc. or not. Updating these beliefs can really lay the foundation for long-term change in girls' own sense of agency and decision-making power, as well as other gender equality outcomes. In the medium term, updating early beliefs can also help girls navigate critical decisions, especially between the ages 18 to 21. And this includes really important decisions around marriage, education, continuation, as well as labor force participation. These are then strong indicators of future agency that women and girls can enjoy in their households and community as they grow older. In the long run, we really expect, and we hypothesize that we expect a generational shift in norms. The innovation is encouraging boys and girls to also engage with their parents and communities to challenge gender norms. And here, again, one critical impact channel is through boys, because this is not only important for community norm shift, but also it has an impact on their own siblings and future spouses. So now let me sort of bring back our practical impact model and see how we use that information and the innovation and sort of bring it into our breadth, depth, and probability of success metric. So for breadth, the breadth estimates we look for that, we look at the states where we focus the innovation will scale up to. We already have estimates for 2 states, Punjab and Odisha, but we further estimate in 10 years where we believe the innovation may reach. So this gives us a range of possible breadth numbers in terms of the number of boys and girls impacted. The second is depth. As Ken mentioned, depth is the average benefit per program participant. So for depth, here we are trying to quantify the impact the program has in girls' lives in terms of agency increase within the domain of household decision making. Now, this is where we quantify and create an agency index to forecast impact of the innovation. Third is probability of success, and this is the most uncertain measure where we try and make it explicit and represent what our uncertainty and risk associated with the scale up is. Here we're typically quite conservative, as GIF actually believes in funding innovations that are high risk but potentially high impact. So let me go a little bit deep into the calculation of depth by looking at specifically trying to understand how we look at agency impacts for this innovation. For the depth calculation, we looked at what the evidence said. So as I said, for this program, Breakthrough partnered with the researchers in India to conduct a randomized evaluation to evaluate the program's impacts. So in order to track the impact, the survey team went and interviewed children after 6 months as well as after 3 years to see if the impact actually persists and some of these attitude changes and shifts are temporary or they continue. The team in fact plans to continue surveying the children even after 5 years to track impacts. The study showed that both for boys and girls, the impact on attitudes was positive and it continued even after 3 years. But the impact for boys seems to be higher, who retain the attitude change for longer. So we in fact see that there's some even behavioral impacts on boys. For instance, them taking up more household share and stepping up within some of these intra-household decisions. Part of this is the fact that because of patriarchal institutions, it is harder for girls to maintain a shift in attitude without any supportive opportunity structures. Whereas for boys, it is easier as they don't have to navigate so many gender challenges. But what we do is we take these impact evaluation results, and then we use that information to model our practical impact depth. So I won't go into a lot of the details, but I do want to give you a quick peek under the hood on how we did this using the summary table. So the first column lists all the different measures of impacts from the randomized evaluation. The second column is where we use the RCT results of attitude change and convert it into an agency index, where 0 is no agency to 1 full agency. And for this, we use attitude change as a proxy for agency gains. So we convert for both boys and girls shift in attitudes because we hypothesize that the change in boys' attitudes also has an impact on gains in agency for girls. In our third column is where we assign our value weights to agency gains. And this is where GIF values agency very highly at the value of 10, which is equivalent to actually doubling annual income of a person over lifetime, or for reference, saving a life in practical impact is valued at the highest possible value weight of 50. So we do see this agency gain as quite transformative, so we value it quite highly. In the final column, we use the agency index and agency weights to calculate lifetime transformational impact the innovation has on students. We assume these attitude shifts to be proxies for future gains in agency of women as they grow older and impute a value of this transformative change in our practical impact model. For these calculations, we assume a slight drop in attitudes for girls, not for boys, based on the RCT results. So we do not yet see any impact on violence against women and girls or social norms, but we also note that these are long-term impacts. And if the assumption of these beliefs is actually going to persist and that they cause behavioral impacts and they're actually realized, we will see that intergenerational impacts will get stronger and these estimates will also get stronger, especially if we believe that these beliefs will actually reach a tipping point that is needed to shift social norms. So bringing all of this together to calculate the impact and practical impact units, we multiply these dimensions to get a range of impacts that we forecast for the breakthrough innovation. As we engage with our partners, and we also track our practical impact assumptions. And this is particularly interesting in the case of breakthrough because the research team is actually planning to do a follow-up after 5 years to see if some of the medium-term impacts, specifically around marriage decisions and education continuation, if that's realized or not. And hence, practical impact is a dynamic forecasting model because as we learn more, we also can update our assumptions and hence update our model. So to conclude, we believe that to make better investment choices, measuring outcomes and being explicit about how we value these outcomes is very important. And through the extension of our model, we've tried to tackle both for agency. So identifying measures of agency and explicitly valuing agency. This has definitely allowed GIF to build a portfolio of gender innovations that has transformative impacts in women and girls' lives. As I mentioned earlier, this is just the beginning, and we hope that this really also pushes the discourse further. And we're really happy and excited to get your thoughts and suggestions on this work. So I think I'll open up for questions now. Yeah.
Thank you. This is very fascinating, Rachna. And so anyone has a question, let's go. Raise your hand and ask directly. Tim. So anyone? Yes, Tim, go ahead.
I found the description of the methodology to be very enlightening and intriguing. My question is, what actually is innovative about this innovation that you have invested in? People are doing these kinds of, what are they called? In all across India, Bangladesh, people are doing these kinds of courtyard sessions and with women, women's empowerment meetings. How did you regard this kind of innovation, this breakthrough group? What was innovative about it?
Rachna, go ahead.
Yeah, I can take that. So there's a couple of things. So one is this program was actually specifically run in schools, in government schools. So it's not a separate program where you're doing out of school work, etc. It's actually set up within government schools where you're trying to engage with boys and girls at an early age. So this is not necessarily targeting women in communities or girls within communities. It's actually targeting children within sort of in grade 5 or 6. And the way that we're actually thinking of scaling this program is within the curriculum. So this is going to be a curriculum change that's going to be part of the program. So the scale up for this is not necessarily an NGO coming in, sort of running a separate out of school program or a safe space, but this is actually a training curriculum that will be embedded in the schooling curriculum. So in Punjab, for instance, it actually will be part of like values or another sort of subject that they have. And so the embedding, and so what GIF is actually investing in is the scale up model of this. So embedding it within schools to deliver it through teachers and within the government schooling system. That's the kind of scaling system that GIF is specifically looking at as an innovative model. And of course, the other piece is that not a lot of these curriculums are necessarily tested. So the evidence piece on actually trying to see whether some of these attitude shifts are persist or not is a very nuanced piece that not a lot of other sort of similar work has done. So that definitely was also an interesting perspective for us.
Any other questions? So Mark, please ask.
Sure. No, this is all very interesting and, builds on a lot of work that has been going on for many years. My question is, are you considering agency also in relationship to preparedness in terms of how preparedness for dealing with crisis? And I would just take COVID-19 as a perfect example of that, which is occurring now. But we could go back in time, especially in South Asia, to many of these crises that have panned out over the last 20 years. Are you considering that, and how, if you are?
I can take that a little bit, and maybe Tony can add. I think that's an interesting question, because perhaps the only way that we look at it is if there is any innovation that reduces the risk of an individual sort of losing agency, would be the only way. So if there is any sort of risk that causes someone to actually drop in their agency, then perhaps that is something that we would be measuring. And I'm just trying to understand, I'm trying to kind of think creatively on how we would actually be measuring that. And definitely that's similar to sort of how we look at, sorry?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you something to work with. Right. So you're right. I mean, if you take a look at risk and gender, we have big differentials of morbidity and mortality by gender related to disease transmission, just as an example, which could have to do with working in a risky environment, needing to have put yourself at risk for for livelihood security, for, so forth and so on. And this risk would be not just at an individual level, but a household and a community level. So in terms of your investments, are your investments also helping preparing not just individuals, but also households and communities with a gender focus, looking at the type of being prepared for a type of risk that we've seen happen probably every 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't have any such innovation in our portfolio right now, but I would say that this is something that Practical Impact would be able to, because one of the things that we are trying to also look at is the third dimension of agency, which I didn't talk about, which is the community and collective agency piece. And I think that is where we do also need to do a little bit more work and look at what are the innovations that are specifically looking at agency at community and social level as well. So I think that's because we definitely have looked at innovations that look at specifically individual in terms of body as well as intra-household. But that is one piece that I think we are specifically looking at and trying to understand what are the different innovations that can actually influence that specific domain.
Yep.
So let me ask you a few questions, Rachna and Ken, both of you can jump in. So this is really fascinating, and you and I have talked about it, given my own work, which we will talk separately. But the aspect of three things which fascinates me. One is, and I would like you to comment on that, both. One is that how do you predict long-term impact? So that is one general, it is open-ended question. You say that 10 years is a long-term impact, right? And so basically you look at the results that are obtained during the project's life cycle, at the end of project's life cycle, end-line evaluation. And based on that, you do some kind of extrapolation, right? And to me, this is a little bit a Pandora's box, because if all these things are changing, the social norms, assets, culture, the way people do things, so then the assumption that whatever the estimates, average effect that you found at the end of the project cycle, and assuming it as a starting point to project 10 years later is, I would like you to comment on that a bit. The second question, and then because all are related, one is that coming back to what Rachna presented. So I was very fascinated with specifically your distinction between measuring agency and valuing agency. I mean, valuing aspect was something for me, it caught my attention, and I would like to learn from you later on. But I have two specific minor questions in this context. One is, you said that the way you measure agency, it has three components: having choice, exercising choice, and achievement of choice. I think there is one huge component that is missing, and that is determining choice. So a big part of agency, from my point of view, is that who determines what choices are available. So we have a patriarchal society and gender biased. And now you are saying that, okay, all these choices, which are marketplace choices, are available. They are available, which is determined by market that is already stacked against women, And then now you are talking about, okay, are those choices are available to women? Are they exercising is, and whether there is achievement? So I feel like there is one component missing before having choice, contribution to determining the choice. So I would like you to comment about that. The third is, and then I will stop and you can choose to answer. Third is the following, is when you showed your slide about short-term impact, medium-term impact, and long-term impact. And in long-term impact, in medium-term, it made perfect sense that in short-term impact, you have changes in attitudes and perceptions. In medium-term impact, you have changes in educational outcomes. And I'm sure you have a lot others. And in the long term, you have norms changes, right? Social norms, gender norms changes. My feeling is, and this is just commentary, this is, I want you to, just for our discussion purpose, is that a sustained change in educational outcome is not possible without changes in gender norms. So I feel that changes in gender norms should not be the long-term outcome, expected outcome of any intervention, particularly when you are funding, because evidence is overwhelming, including Seema's work. She has, I did not know, I was very surprised pleasantly that you are working with her in Haryana and others. So fascinating work by her, And by the way, paper is coming in American Economic Review now. So this paper. And so for me is that why you are thinking of changes in social norm, gender norms in many countries around the world. It is the starting barrier, most profound barrier to sustained, meaningful improvement in women's outcome. So unless a program focuses on changes in norms in the beginning, then all those material improvements seem to be short-lived. At least that is the evidence I'm looking at. So I'll stop here and you can comment.
Well, thanks for those questions. I'll field the first one and then let Rachna handle the second two. But thank you for raising these things that we're very much preoccupied with these kinds of questions. On predicting long-run impact, first of all, I want to stress again how it's essential we do that, because for someone who funds at the level of the World Bank, say, or a large NGO, you could ask, well, how many millions of liters of clean water did you provide? How many thousands of children did you vaccinate yesterday? But that's not our game. We're trying to catalyze something. We're aiming at this curve that's going to go high. And of course, it's really, really difficult to do this prediction, but it's not impossible. And I draw the analogy with what our colleagues come from the venture investing field do. So venture capitalist buys a company or invests in an early stage company and says, well, I intend to sell this in about 5 years. What's that company going to be worth in 5 years? Well, the value of that company in 5 years is the discounted present value of the profits from years 5 to 15. So already, this is how financial prediction works. And of course, it's really difficult. But there are things we can use. So we have scenarios for how our innovations are going to scale up. In this case, we've got scenarios about what's going to be the adoption state by state in India. And we don't make point predictions. We make, we're humble because A, our prediction capability is limited, and B, the world is inherently uncertain. So we make wide range predictions. But I think the key to what we're doing is that because of our emphasis on evidence, we're always coming back and re-estimating. So because we build evidence generation into our work and we're tracking progress, after 3 years, we'd say, oh, we were wildly over-optimistic about the breadth, but we underestimated depth. And then we kind of iterate. So it's challenging, and there's a lot, we could talk about about super forecasters and things like that, but we'll put that for another time. So let me turn over to Rachna.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So on your second question around choice, I think that's an interesting one, because I think when we thought about like whether having choice or not is also part of like a situation where a lot of women don't have any choice, and what are the innovations in space of expanding choices. So, and I'll give you an example. One of the innovations that we're considering right now is looking at actually reimagining labor force participation for women within sectors where women are completely excluded because of cultural and social norms. And that's kind of trying to create choices where it's not even in your choice set, and actually trying to open up some jobs, which are jobs with dignity and sort of quality of jobs and safe and inclusive jobs, where women are completely excluded. So that I would say is, for instance, an innovation where we're looking at really agency by expanding choices that women otherwise wouldn't have. Now, for the third question on the long term, I think is an interesting one, because although the theory of change that I showed short-term attitude, mid-term critical decisions, and long-term norm, but actually it's working the other way around. So the innovation is not actually talking about any of these middle things or giving a cash transfer or doing anything that's directly improving education or health or anything. The innovation and breakthrough is just trying to have discussions around norms. So the idea is really to actually have this curriculum that's trying to break stereotypes, that's trying to talk about acceptability of violence, and trying to talk about acceptability in terms of women's work outside of home. And the whole curriculum is pretty much trying to target regressive norms. But of course, the theory of change piece is something that we don't think that by teaching a child to shift norms is going to happen. It just takes that long. It just takes that, and sort of the idea of tipping point is that it does take, a 25-30% of the population to shift from regressive to progressive norms for norm shift to happen. So it just so happens that it comes at the end, but it's actually quite front and central to an innovation like breakthrough.
That's very good. Any other questions before I monopolize it?
I do actually have one question for you, Rachna. So ages of children have varying levels of efficacy in certain avenues of their development. And I wanted to ask what variables were undergone to choose an age in which to begin this attempt on impacting children's mindset, as well as do you think earlier or later times of education could have proven more formative for candidate mindsets?
No, that's an interesting question. I think part of why breakthrough chose that age was also perhaps like some focus group discussion in terms of, we believe that at a point it's too late, but, this is perhaps the right age group at which you can perhaps have these conversations where these attitudes may not be fully set. But at the same time, actually, we don't have an innovation in our portfolio, but one of the innovations that we did look at, and which I thought was very exciting, was an innovation within gender norms and edutainment within early childhood space. So, people have different ways in engaging with young boys and girls as well, and talking about sort of through, fun edutainment sort of content. So I think there are, sort of spaces that are innovations that are looking at very different age groups and talking about norms at a very early age also, which I think can also be quite impactful. And in fact, one of the things that we didn't talk about is exactly this, like having a bit of a life cycle approach to types of innovations that can happen, which might be impactful at different points in time in our lives. And again, that's not just for girls, it is for boys and girls, sort of kind of like the larger community of children and adolescents, and then later on in life in terms of couples. So like, what are the different innovations that might be sort of, I think that's definitely something that's quite interesting.
Thank you.
Ajhar.
I just have a clarifying question. I'm wondering if the participants had similar gender attitudes to start with.
I think he's talking about the CMAS study in Haryana, right?
Okay.
So in the school study.
Okay. Yeah, so the RCT in Haryana is quite interesting because it's designed as a randomized evaluation. So they actually can exactly track what the impact of the program is specifically on attitude and behaviors. So they actually have a number of different questions specifically around attitudes. So some attitudes towards work, some attitudes about like household share, and attitudes towards like, I think, a few other domains. And they create a really nice, interesting index to compare what the impact is over 6 months. So they definitely see like a significant high magnitude impact on attitude shift. They do actually do some other interesting experimental data work also, around behavioral outcomes, but some of the strong impacts were specifically on attitude.
Thank you.
Bratati, go.
Yeah, my question is about the breakdown of your current deployment of fund between government, not-for-profit entities and for-profit impact firms, and also by type of instrument, and whether that the actuality of deployment differed from what your starting thesis was.
Well, I'll take that. I don't have the exact figures at hand. They're on our, I encourage everybody to look at our impact report on our website, but roughly speaking, about our funds are about equally split between for-profits and NGOs or academics on the other side. We have not yet provided any direct assistance to government. That's probably not the way we will work. Basically, our views of how our innovations will scale up is that on one side, we may invest in a private sector firm, and either it will itself grow big or it will spark a market transformation where others come in and emulate it. That's one route to scale. On the public side, very much like the Tower and Kitoli, the idea is demonstrate something that that shows to the government that it's worth incorporating in some kind of public program, and that they will then scale it up. The instruments on the NGO side, it's entirely grants, and on the risk capital side, we do a mixture of equity, convertible debt, and loans.
So Ken, to following up to the question about long-term impact. So here was the thought I had, and I'm sure, and I have been reading your work and what Rachna is doing on agency and the index. One thing I had thought is, because I have my very good friend and co-authors here, and also they are the principals of IfAD, Jane Bambauer and Charles Nosser. So I don't want to put them in a spot, but perhaps they will have some questions. One thing is, for me, is this: when you think of long-term impact, instead of looking at impact in terms of long-term, have you thought about that one way to be sure? The idea of long-term impact is basically your underlying rationale is that you want to make sure that whatever project you invest, it has a sustainable impact beyond the longevity of your project. I mean, that is the goal. How do you know that you have made a lasting impact? Because most of the projects, you know that it is life cycle by life cycle, project life cycle. So instead of looking at long-term 10-year, 15 years impact, have you thought about, I'm sure you have, but just I wanted to more details, is that look at the kind of impact rather than duration. So for example, you mentioned some agency is one of them, right? But agency, there are different aspects to it. There could be a lot of behavioral traits, people's attitudes, social preferences, risk aversion, whether people are consistent, intertemporal, what is the nature of their optimization. So all those, those things even can change in the short term. And these are the behavioral traits. Even if they change in the 5 years, you know that if changes in behavioral traits, the way people do business, their mindset changes, even in the short run, there is some element of irreversibility. So what my question is that it is not just about looking at an indicator, let's say income, poverty reduction, asset, or decision making, and seeing that what is the impact in 5 years? What is the impact in 10 years, 15 years, something like that? Have you also thought about, we don't care about, we look at the indicators and we prioritize whatever the project you are funding. These are the certain changes we value more. Our people's executive function is improving. Our people's mental and emotional well-being is improving. People's risk preferences are changing. Attitude towards entrepreneurship is changing, and those changes are irreversible. So in that way, for me, it feels like you have immediate result that your project has changed the way things people do, but also they are the indication that the impact will self-sustain in the long run.
I guess it plays out differently in different kinds of interventions. So, I mean, to go back to this issue of norm change, again, we'd be looking at first changes in attitudes, among the direct beneficiaries, then changes in their behavior. And then this kind of simple model of tipping of norms would say that Rachna referred to, says that we would expect that once 20% of the population had changed their own attitudes, that if we surveyed them and said, will you be sanctioned or rewarded if you behave in this way? They will now perceive, oh, I see around me that there are enough people who will approve of this behavior that I'm no longer reluctant to make that decision. So we would imagine being able to do a population survey and see that this has changed. And the mechanism might be through Tauhidur and Katholi, but again, we would hope that there would be emulators that would say, all right, we'll adapt this program, but and it will therefore spread out.
We have few minutes left. Any more questions?
A question.
Yeah.
I'm interested whether there is some indirect impact for others without treatment, such as other members in the same family, the older sisters or younger sisters, and the neighbors and people from nearby area.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good question. Unfortunately, I don't think the evaluation was set up to see spillovers in neighbors, but I think they do actually they are interested in sibling effect. I don't remember actually if they measure that in this midline and what the impact was, but I think one of the hypotheses is that especially for boys, that there might be impact on siblings who are girls, and like what is the intra-household impact on that. I don't think they found, I'm not 100% certain whether they actually surveyed them in the end or not and what the impact was, so I can't fully answer this, but this is a very important question. I think this is something also that's kind of indicative of exactly norm shift also. So if you are really thinking about whether these sort of children and students are having these conversations or not, you would expect some of these changes. But yeah, I'm not too sure that they actually see any of this or they do survey the siblings or not.
Thank you.
So one last question. It is late night for Ken and Rachna. It's getting close to bedtime. So one question, Ken and Rachna, both of you what is next few areas you see Global Innovation Fund focusing on? So we are a group of researchers here. A lot of students here we have is PhD students and graduate students. So from your point of view, Global Innovation Fund, in next 5 years, 10 years, what are you going to be doing? What kind of issues and questions that you might be interested in, where the places like IfAD that can be a source of work with you? And so that's the last question.
Well, here I'll take this, and Rachna, feel free to add on. Here, I think maybe our 10-year ability to do 10-year forecasts is more limited when we apply it to ourselves. I think right now that we feel like we've really opened up a whole world in looking at these issues of agency. And in response to that earlier question about disasters, we want to intensify our attention to the climate crisis, and we think that actually it might be quite natural for us to look at how our kind of work can promote resilience, and looking at the intersection of agency and resilience is something that we're really enthusiastic about exploring. And would let me conclude by saying we would be delighted to continue to engage with your initiative and with your colleagues. We found this a very stimulating conversation, and thank you for the opportunity.
With that, thank you. It's a wonderful talk, and it was our pleasure to have you. And I'm sure one thing is that for my UFA colleague and a student, I promise you that Ken and Rachna will be back for in-person sometimes in the future, and we will see them and we will have this discussion in person. And so thank you, Ken, and good night.
Thank you. Look forward to that. Goodbye.